Tec Sounds presents EduTrends.
So welcome to the EduTrends podcast and webcast brought to you by the Institute for the Future of Education. I am Pepe Escamilla, Associate Director of the Institute for the Future of Education, and we're very happy to have a very important guest today, Thomas Weko, who is Senior Scholar at the George Washington University Institute of Public Policy. We're happy to have you here, Thomas.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation, Pepe.
Great to have you. You have been here during the day in Monterrey this hot summer, and talking about skills. And you just delivered a conference, a webcast also by the Institute for the Future of Education around the failure or the broken promises of skills, no, in terms of what we expected at the revolution, no? Unfinished revolution was the name of that. Okay, I was trying to remember the name. And this, how are we doing in this unfinished revolution? What's the state of skills development, skill recognition around the world? How will you make an assessment of that?
Well, it varies.
And I have to say that also your previous position was in the OECD.
Yes.
So you have some awareness of what's happening around the world because of that.
And I mean, in some senses, people have clearer expectations of older educational credentials and the skills they signal than they do newer ones, right? I mean, if I say to you, someone's taken a degree in electrical engineering with a specialty in X, you have some broad understanding of
even
the bundle.
Even if you don't know what is electrical engineering.
Precisely so. But you have some broad, it's like, okay, this is the bundle of skills this person will have, kind of. I think as you start getting into either newer programs of study, things that are interdisciplinary, for example, and more innovative and newer programs of study, I think...
like mechatronics, that is very popular here, for instance.
Yes. Or in... sort of social sciences and humanities and other fields, if someone says, I have a degree in sustainability studies, I think then the comprehension of what skills does this person possess? What is that set? What is the bundle? Then that becomes very uncertain. So it's hard for people to signal what they have. And then once you move away from like university degree programs into alternative credentials, if someone says, I have a badge in something.
Full stack web programmer, for instance.
Okay. Well, I think there's more, there's decent comprehension of technical skills that are sort of delivered to industry standard. Yeah. But, I mean, I've seen higher education institutions award badges in creative leadership or a variety of things that, I mean, I think there's soft skills. Let's make a little sort of typology. Yeah? And I think new programs, soft skills rather than technical skills, and new kinds of credentials, like a badge or a micro-credential, those are the places then where I think it's much harder to communicate. I mean, there are exceptions, because if you get a credential awarded by Google in user experience design, right? I think that's comprehensible. Again, because there's kind of an industry standard behind that. But I think once you get into things like alternative credentials, I have sometimes described it as sort of islands of understanding and a sea of ignorance and confusion, right? I mean, because there are places where people have a good understanding of what those things mean, but there's certainly other areas. I mean, if someone came to you and said, you should hire me because I have a badge in creative leadership and team building, you would say, what?
What is that useful for?
Yeah.
But there is also what was the recognition for employers? Because at the end,
Yes.
we don't care a lot if people doesn't understand, but if the employers care. And I've seen also another example that because you're doing like a typology of different cases where it's a little bit strange. There's also programs. For instance, I offer an MBA disruptor that is not accredited. No, it's and in 8 months I give you the same that an MBA that is compressed and is less expensive. So that will be another example that you know what an MBA is. But what about the offering of this company or this startup or whatever? How do you see that employers are reacting to these offerings?
Well, there's been some interesting work done by some people at Northeastern University in the United States, where they've done sample surveys of human resource officers in firms. And one of the things that you see is that they themselves express about the sort of program you've described. They express uncertainty, right? A lack of understanding about what skills people will bring based upon that credential. Obviously, everyone brings other things. They bring a work history. Yeah, they might bring letters of recommendation, or in addition to a credentialed form of learning. But sometimes the signal that that credential and its descriptors contain is going to be hard for an employer to understand, and that's unfortunate. I mean, we want people who invest time, who invest money in acquiring something, to come out with something that's well understood. Yeah, and that isn't always the case.
And how do you think that we can work towards? What are the conditions that we need to have recognition of those kind of credentials by employers, learners, and maybe the general public even?
I mean, I suppose the traditional recommendation is to have the employer participation in the development of the credential, so that the learning and the credential, right, in its design, right, is aligned against industry practice. So I'm recently aware of an example in Ireland where Maynooth University has a micro-credential program in brewing and distilling, which is it's an important industry in Ireland, to be fair. Yeah, it's an important product export, and that's a case where the chemistry professors are working hand in hand with the brewing and distilling industry and developing learning and assessment in light of industry standards, right? So that when someone completes a qualification, there's a good understanding of what that is. That's easier to do in some fields than others. I mean, we don't have good ways now of communicating soft skills. We just don't. That's not a sort of... Employers will set tests and exams and try to assess job candidates sort of using their own things that they've built, but there aren't as sort of easily, or maybe you're aware of them, but I don't know, I'm not well aware of assessments that demonstrate to employers in ways they understand about team working or creativity or other skills that someone may have that are soft, but nonetheless important to them, right? That's, there's not a Nuevo Leon or Mexico or industry assessment of creativity skills that you can administer to someone and have them come back and say, I've received, these very high marks demonstrating my team working skills.
Mm-hmm. Most of the time will be by observation, and like an assessment center is the closer thing I can come to, but maybe it's not the panacea.
Yeah, I mean, obviously firms themselves will build assessment procedures. And there's some really famous examples of that as a way of trying to go through their pool of candidates to identify who might be appropriate. Huh?
It's very interesting what you said, because we are not prepared to assess those soft skills, and all the reports on industry said that that's one of the most important things.
Yeah,
no?
exactly.
So it's a completely disconnect
Yes.
between that.
Yes. But as you can imagine, I mean, it's not an easy task. I mean, if you talk to a psychometrician or an assessment expert, it's not an easy task to build an assessment of creative thinking. And perhaps, creative thinking in fashion design, in architecture, and in other
Business.
it interacts with disciplines and technical skills in
Context
ways
is very
that,
important. Yes.
Absolutely.
So you were saying that this program in an Irish university, but alternative credentials were initially developed by startups.
Yes.
Mainly, I think in the computer science.
It's the IT field, absolutely.
And I think also mainly because of the lack of it's a business opportunity, because there's a lack of talent, in that area. But how universities should be operating? How are they operating in that area? And what do you think is the future for universities in the alternative credentials?
Well, I think probably the future is in partnerships, collaboration. So, obviously you could try to build your own credentials, alternative credentials, deliver those to learners, and then think that will work in your region or on some wider scope. There might be cases where there's some real specificity of local need and your own institution's ability to develop those, and there's a continuing demand, so you can make a business model out of that, so to speak. But I think, is it not the case that Monterrey Tech is entering into sort of collaboration with, it has edX and Coursera and other kinds of collaborators. A lot of there's very strong interest now in partnerships and embedding some forms of skill credentialing, either inside of study programs as a way of assuring that graduates have some recognizable skills in the labor market, or making that part of the institutional mission for lifelong learning. I don't know how many institutions will continue to try and build that learning themselves, and how many of them will outsource it. And I frankly don't know how much scope there might be for, say, customization of things that are developed externally. But I know that it's important. And in working here in Mexico some years ago, I saw institutions that were embedding, for example, the IT certifications.
So in the case of at Tec de Monterrey, we have a new regulation. I think it's a couple of years old. That after like 4 years of experimentation, we decided to regulate things that we were doing like in a sandbox, And now the continuing education area can deliver programs that are labeled with micro or macro credentials, depending on the size of the credentials. And some of them can be transferable to a degree, depending on how they are done. And also degrees, both the undergraduate degree or the graduate degrees, can offer partial recognition of micro or macro credential for partial studies. So we are trying to do it both sides, moving from one side to the other, with certain regulations. But in fact, to do that, we have to be aware that the regulations of the government doesn't follow. So what are the things that governments are doing around the world that could be good examples and how do you think we should move to improve the innovation in this area?
Yeah. Well, let me back up a second and say, I'm really impressed to hear that your institution sort of experimented for 3 or 4 years in a kind of pilot phase before taking sort of and setting regulations about how it wanted to move forward. Because there certainly are a lot of institutions that would do it the other way around, right? And start from saying, let's have a set of regulations without first sort of learning what they need to know before regulating. So that's very good. What should governments do? Well, I don't want to be too cynical here. A lot of the innovation in this space came because it was outside of a lot of the heavy regulatory schemes of government. Once government starts delivering funding, recognizing degrees, right, and putting its mark on an educational award, it brings in a lot of regulations, some of which may really limit innovation. It's probably it is the case, I suppose, that many of the innovations in this area have taken place in higher education systems that are rather lightly regulated and steered. And this could be sort of in the more sort of the Anglo model, as opposed to some of the, say, continental European systems where you may have traditions of very strong direction and more difficulty for institutions to innovate in these ways. But I think in our experience working with governments, what we've done with the alternative credentials, and especially things like micro-credentials, is to really emphasize that they can't regulate the quality of those things in the same way they might do a medical degree, say. Right? And what they need to do, instead of having a heavy regulation at the level of a study program, is to have the institution take ownership and responsibility for the quality, right? That's where it really needs to rest. The institution needs to set in place its own rules, its own policies, and its own sort of criteria about the quality of the alternative credentials that it's going to develop and offer. Because if you try and regulate that very, very tightly, it just, you need, the nature of these credentials is that they need to be flexible. If you're supposed to be responding to the world of work, you can't be sort of managing and overseeing and regulating those programs from the center of government in the same way that you would a dental or medical degree or something like that. So that's important for governments to bear in mind. The thing that they can do also to support this is a lot of governments, and the European Commission has been working at this, which is to come up with standard descriptors. So to say, if you're going to be awarding these credentials, you really need to use these 20 standard descriptors when you're creating a record of the student's educational outcome and conferring a certificate or diploma or whatever the award is. And these standard descriptors will tell other institutions that may be receiving this work, or tell employers about how the learning took place. The student was how many ECTS, how many European credits were involved in the award of this learning, right? How was the learner assessed? Under what conditions, did you ensure that there was,
Those each part of that is one of the descriptors.
There's a set, and I'd be happy to share that with you. There's a set of about 15 sort of common descriptors that they think that all countries and education institutions should be using to create some greater possibility of the exchange of records and shared understanding. I think actually that's a pretty good way to work. The shared descriptors are not heavy. Yeah, um, but it's still an effective way to put some commonality around it. The other thing that some countries have done is some of them have qualification frameworks. So they've put new credentials inside of qualification frameworks. So someone will then have a set of descriptors about how the learning took place, how the student was assessed, how many credits were involved, and then they'll receive as part of the student record some information about the level of, this took place at level 7 in the Irish qualification framework.
So the example of Singapore like that, or is a little bit different?
Singapore is not an OECD member country, and I didn't have the privilege of working with them. I would.
They have open source taxonomies of the most important jobs in
yes,
like financial or like manufacturing, etc. They have the different jobs and they have a taxonomy of competencies.
Yes.
Define for each of the jobs.
And that's even more informative, right? Because now you're going from sort of descriptors of how much learning activity took place, how was the learner tested, right? Who delivered the instruction? What was the location? Those are just very
on the surface.
Those are exactly so. Those are not skill level by any means. Huh?
Okay.
And then even putting something in a qualification framework. I mean, it's like saying this is at level 7, which is equivalent to a bachelor level study. Again, that's just in the same postal code, but it doesn't tell you anything in detail about the skill bundle somebody has. So what Singapore is doing is much more ambitious. Huh? Yes, because then you're trying to create a skill taxonomy, a language of skills that everybody can use in that system, right? And then there's a lot of clarity about what skills people are acquiring, and they've done really lovely work to show sort of how people have moved within different sectors of the economy, and what skills are sort of transferable and portable. It's world leading. It's world leading work.
Is there a hope for a sort of a universal skills taxonomy that will help us move from one country to another country?
Yeah, of course.
And also with the advantage of not having to redo it every time, no? So it will be like
that's when you need essentially a universal. That's when you need to use artificial intelligence to create a kind of universal, right? You take sort of the descriptors and you have an enormous set of these, right? And you sort of train against those and you create a kind of a translation tool. I mean, because you translate those anyway. Someone would come to you here at Monterrey Tech from
Germany.
Yeah. And you would have to sit down in a very slow process of hand working, right? And I did this myself. And you would have to look at the set of courses they've taken. And then below that, you have to understand, you have to get the learning materials from the courses to figure out whether you want to recognize this work. I mean, we don't need to be, we're beyond that now. I think, not everybody in the world is going to speak the same language, right? Well, that was the hope of whatever Esperanto. But, I think it's possible for us to think about a skill translator capacity. And we have those in voice, right? I mean, you can do sort of real-time translation using technology. We can do translation using AI.
Yes, and I think that the one possibility for countries that don't have the size or the resources to do that, they could eventually translate and adapt to their own context those frameworks that will be very useful as a national reference, not like they do in countries like Singapore and other. You were saying that we need flexibility from the public policy side on defining alternative credentials because there have to be flexible by
Space for
nature,
innovation,
responsive,
yeah.
on the
Yes.
to the needs.
Innovation, responsive to the labor market and the sort of changing innovation needs, because, the skills demanded in the labor market, I mean, it's like, are we still using Python now, or have we moved beyond that, right? I mean, or C++ or whatever. I mean, the rate of change in those is in some areas can be really great. So you need that kind of capacity to respond. You can't just say, we're going to put in place a study program that's going to look the same way for the next 10 years. And the institution needs the freedom itself to be innovative and to think about, okay, how am I going to pull in people I need to get architects to come in from outside to help us design these new credentials we're building for the continuing learning of architects. If you have regulations in place that say, oh, no, only someone who holds the university appointment and has habilitation can participate in the development of these, that's going to kill the kind of innovation you need at your university.
But in terms of, thinking in terms of government and the learner, which is like sort of the consumer of the education nowadays, I think that a government can say, well, the investment in an alternative credential is smaller in terms of resources, time, so I will let the market to more or less self-regulate, no? So every provider will be responsible of what they do.
But there are smaller steps you can take.
Okay.
Instead of saying, heavy regulation or
no regulation at all.
No regulation at all. There are lots of points in between. And Australia has done some amazing things.
Okay.
It would be worth looking into that. Because essentially what they've decided to do is essentially with these descriptors, right? Then they've built a web platform. So institutions are like, what the idea of that is to create a capacity for learners to survey the offerings and to compare offerings. So what they're doing is they're not telling the providers what to do, but they are telling them that they have to describe what they do in some common and standardized ways. And this goes into a platform then that everyone can see, right? That learners can see to make study choices. So I invite you to go online and you can look and you can someone can go on in there and they can sort of specify parameters about, I want to acquire, these skills. I want it to take this long. I'm interested in this kind of provider. And it will sort of then run against the database and give them, sort of alternative credential learning opportunities. So you can kind of, at least without sort of undermining their ability to innovate, you can make them talk about and share information about these in ways that are common and understandable. And they help employers because they can go there and see what someone has acquired, and also helps the learners. So there's some interesting models in between.
Great. In another flexibility characteristic of alternative credentials is the possibility of stackability towards something that is more advanced, in particular a degree. No. So in Mexico and all the countries in Latin America that I know of, and many other countries, I think also in Europe, particularly in the southern part of Europe that are more familiar, usually it's impossible to take something that it was acquired outside of the system inside the official 4-degree education. So what will be the ways to introduce flexibility in the public policies for countries like ours? Or like mine?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, and certainly it is the goal. It is the policy goal, very strongly sort of, policy hope and aspiration articulated by the European Commission, that European Union member countries will, in designing this learning, ensure that one of the characteristics is stackability. I think the things we've been talking about help. I mean, in the end, academic institutions are autonomous and or highly autonomous anyway, and they have a lot of control over what work they choose to recognize and what policies they set around work that they receive and attribute to a study program. But the more that you can do as a government and as even things like ANOIAS and the higher education associations can try to build, again, common descriptors, common ways of stating what this offer looks like so it's put in a public fashion. That's going to build some measure of trust. The other thing, sometimes governments make this requirement that essentially the credentials are designed for stackability. Now, I'm not thinking now about sort of how you make that a living, real requirement. But that means that you could say, look, you're creating one of these credentials.
That's what we did. So it's, in order to be stackable, this has to be defined.
Yes, and
from inception that to be stackable.
So it's designed for stackability. As part of say, the government, say, a National Accreditation Commission could say, okay, university, you need to have a policy for the micro-credentials you're going to offer. And one of the tests we think every university should be applying is, as you assure the quality of your study programs, is it designed for stackability? Or actually, in the case of Australia, they actually have in their public-facing information whether something is designed for stackability or not. At the minimum, you have a responsibility to tell a learner, right? Because not everybody, of course, there will be people who will say, oh, it's of no consequence because I simply want to go return to working or continue working. So that's okay. But I think you really need to be very transparent about that. I guess the other thing would be keeping track of stackability so that you could imagine that in your university's record system, I don't know if governments are up to this, but you could actually look to see whether, because that's going to be contained in an academic transcript, whether someone has actually been able to have that applied to a study program. Certainly, I think you are a very sophisticated institution. You would have the ability to probably, I think, track that here at your level.
Thank you, Thomas. We are arriving to the end of our talk, unfortunately, but I would like to challenge you to do some do's and don'ts of alternative credential for the people that are hearing this podcast and are planning. I would like to do that in my institution. What are the obvious or common sense things to do or not to do to create a new credential in your institution so that maybe you can start in the right direction?
Well, you're asking me, but I think you're probably as equally qualified or more so to answer that question than I am. But I'll have a go at it nonetheless. Huh?
Unfortunately, I did the question.
I appreciate that. So what advice to give? Well, first of all, be clear about what you want the outcome of that to be. Now, this is back to the immediate past discussion. Be very clear about whether you intend for that thing to be directly labor market engaged, or whether you intend for that, in addition, or perhaps even alternatively, to have the ability to build into a longer educational credential. That's really important. I mean, I think institutions probably need to take a very serious look about their own capabilities. Do you have, once you kind of know what the purpose is, I think the second thing is to have a vision of quality. What does good look like in one of these programs? What kind of expectations and practices should you set in place? Because in the end, you need to take responsibility for the quality of that. It really is down to the institution. People in the government can look to see, whether they can check up on you, but the final responsibility and the first responsibility rests with you. And so you need to have not only a vision of what they're to accomplish, but a vision of what quality looks like. Part of that vision of quality, I think, in many cases, is going to need to be very confident that in the case of stackability, you've designed for stackability. In the case you have any vision of this, engaging with the labor market, that you have a very serious process of consultation and engagement. And I would insist, if I were the rector, right, that you have some clear information you can provide me about the alignment of this to current and emerging skill demands and how your provision is aligned to that. Right, that's a requirement. And I think beyond that, I would say, can you do this yourself? Should you be doing it in conjunction with other universities? Should you be working in collaboration with external firms? What's the model you want to follow to do this? And are you clear that you can get the kind of buy-in from within your institution, right? The time of people from the Faculty of Engineering or the School of Medicine or whatever it is to make this program work. Obviously, the other thing is to be clear about the demand side for this in the labor market. And I would insist, and if I were creating a review process and approving these in my university, those are among the things I would look for. And there are institutions out there that have now got some years of experience at this. So, if somebody was entering this space, they would be very unwise not to seek advice or technical assistance or some support from those who have some really good experience, because you want to make new mistakes rather than mistakes that have already been made. Yeah,
it's difficult to learn from. Vicarious learning is difficult now sometimes, but yes, you have to risk, and sometimes you make some mistakes, but you want to be sure that those you have alternatives planned for those mistakes. I will say also that there are some resources. We have the Alternative Credentials report of the Observatory of the Institute for the Future of Education, and there are other wonderful reports from OECD and other institutions around the world that can be read. And I think one of the don'ts that I would like to add to what your do's is, I don't know if the expression is, don't offer old wine in new bottles.
That's perfectly the expression. And I actually fear, when governments when governments see the need for this and they commit funding to universities and other higher education institutions, obviously, one of the you and I would have the same fear, which is that there will be old wine in new bottles. So there'll be sort of just repackaging what they've already done. I mean, in a sense, it's easy, it's fast, yeah. But so much of what is sort of the historical offering isn't appropriate, and it would really be a terrible mistake. And that's a really good don't.
Yes, because it will be vaccinating the market against this kind of new.
That's actually a wonderful point, which is both the learners and employers would look at that and say, hey, it will surely lead to the failure of the market once they see that this is nothing more than this is just the same old thing and in new bottles.
Thank you, Thomas. This is a good way of finishing our conversation that I enjoy a lot, and I'm sure that our audience also will enjoy it. And I will be a great value for everyone. And we hope to have you soon back here in Tec de Monterrey and the EduTrends podcast.
It's been a terrific experience being here, and I look forward to coming back. Thank you.
For more information, visit observatory.tec.mx/edutrendspodcast and ife.tec.mx. A special thanks to Tecnológico de Monterrey, the Institute for the Future of Education, and the Tec Sounds team. Tec Sounds producer Miguel Mejia. EduTrends producers Esteban Venegas and Cristian Igosa. Stay tuned and play Tec Sounds in your favorite podcast app for other great shows and content.